This is A New Angle, a show about cool people doing awesome things in and around Montana. I'm your host, Justin Angle. This show is supported by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. Hey folks, welcome back, and thanks for tuning in. Today, I am speaking with Penny Ronning, co-founder of the Yellowstone Human Trafficking Task Force. Penny is also a small business owner, a filmmaker, a passionate protector of wildlife, and a former candidate for Congress.
The hard part about this is getting adults to understand how fast this happens for a young person.
Penny served 4 years on the Billings City Council and has demonstrated a deep commitment to public service for decades. This conversation contains sensitive themes regarding sex trafficking, mental illness, and suicide. If you or a loved one is considering suicide, call the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline at 988. Penny, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me as a guest today.
So tell us, where did you grow up and what did your parents do?
Well, I grew up in Billings, Montana. I was born in Aberdeen, South Dakota, but we moved from South Dakota to Montana when I was very young. My dad owned and operated a restaurant, and my mom was a career federal employee. She began her career with the federal government with the FBI. I always share this with people. It's fascinating, but her very first job and her very first employer, her direct supervisor, was J. Edgar Hoover.
So we're here to talk today mostly about human trafficking, the Yellowstone Human Trafficking Task Force. But before we get into that, Penny, I have to ask about the vast array of things you've done in your career. How would you describe your professional record?
I feel very fortunate to have been raised by parents that made sure that their children knew whatever they wanted to do, they could do if they worked hard, if they set their mind to it. I'm very conscious of the fact, though, that I was raised in a family that had two working parents, and this would have been in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. Two working parents that supplied our family with a upper middle class income that provided opportunities to my sister and I. I also had a mother that absolutely loved to travel, so she would take me with her in on her vacations or her work environment. Whenever she had to travel for work, she would take me with her, and I loved that. And so my mom really exposed me to many cultures throughout the world as a young girl, and that really set me on the path toward wanting to work in different areas and different industries that continued to allow me to have a big, expansive view of the world and work within different systems that were bigger than, just kind of a small, localized area of interest.
And it seems like service and storytelling are sort of two themes of your career that tie together. Talk about those two things and the role they've played in your work.
Growing up in Billings, Montana, I was a creative kid. In the 1960s and 70s, for females, one of the things I will share, and even for probably any gender really in Montana during the 60s and 70s and probably even the early 80s, the creative arts were not something that were heavily stressed as being a career option, most especially for a female. And so during my schooling, when I would express my creative interests, they would typically get shot down by my teachers and the career guidance counselors. When I was a senior in high school, I was meeting with the guidance counselor to talk about my college career plans. And neither one of my parents graduated from college, and my older sister didn't either. So I was the first one in my family that wanted to go to school. The guidance counselor asked me where I wanted to go and what my college career ideas were and plans and dreams were. And I told him that I wanted to go to USC Film School. He reached across the desk, patted my hand, and said, "That's a nice dream, but let's talk about what you're going to do for a living."
Gosh.
And that was the first time in my life that anyone had said something so directly to me that my dreams for my adult life need to be rethought. Long story short, I went into psychology at MSU in Bozeman and almost flunked out because it really wasn't what I wanted to do. I pursued travel and went into the airline industry and became a flight attendant in my first real professional career that took me all over the world. And I felt just extraordinarily blessed to have that job. And it was based over in Europe and overseas, and flew in and out of the Middle East and all over the world in my 20s and into my 30s, and decided to go to film school and moved back to Montana and went to Bozeman, MSU in Bozeman, and got my undergraduate degree in film, and then went on to get a master's degree in business because I was in producing. And so wanted to further that education in contracts and understanding the business end of filmmaking. And then eventually went on to law school from there. I loved law school, loved it, loved it, loved it. And I'm so grateful for that education. But I became clear to me that it was way too much computer time and paperwork. And I was
Got it.
like, oh, I'm going to be stuck at a desk for the rest of my life doing this stuff.
So let's talk about human trafficking. What is it, first of all, and how big of a problem is it here in Montana?
So, human trafficking is really, when we talk about the umbrella subject of human trafficking, that covers two specific sections, which is sex trafficking and labor trafficking.
Okay.
And they have very distinctive business models that function within those two specific areas. So, for human trafficking to be the crime that is investigated and prosecuted and convicted on, force, fraud, or coercion must be in place. And that's at the federal level. That's the federal definition. So force, fraud, or coercion must be in place to either compel someone into a commercial sex act or into labor trafficking, which is, forced work. So that's the definition of human trafficking in a nutshell. But what we see predominantly in Montana is a mixture of both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Labor trafficking is much, much more significant of a crime in the United States than what we think, and even in Montana. But sex trafficking tends to be what law enforcement and the prosecution system tends to go after more aggressively than labor trafficking. Both
Okay.
areas of this crime are incredibly difficult to investigate and prosecute because of the levels and all of the different business models and the different actors, the criminal actors that have to be involved in the crime. It's a very challenging crime to investigate and prosecute.
And before we get into the details, how did you get interested in this area of work, and so much so that you've sort of made it to your life's work for the last several years?
I'm the daughter of a trafficking survivor. My
Right.
mom was trafficked by an older brother from the time she was 5 to 9 years old in rural South Dakota. This would have been in the 1940s. At that time, and really for many years since, we didn't have language called human trafficking. We didn't have language called trauma, sexual assault, those types of legal words and definitions that we have now. What my mom had in the 1940s was shh, don't say anything. Human trafficking at the federal level is still a relatively new crime in the United States. It's only been a federal crime with using the words human trafficking put together since the year 2000. At that time in the 1940s, because my mom was never moved across a state line or across a border, there weren't laws in place to actually protect her or bring any type of legal action against my uncle or the other criminal actors that were in place. I think for many people, they think if something is bad or harmful, that there must be a law in place, and that isn't always the case.
And why is that? Why were there not many laws in many states?
When you take a look at the history of our country, the majority, if not all of our laws, especially up until recent years, were written by men.
Hmm.
They were all written from a male point of view. So when you take a look at sexual crimes and sexual violent crimes, and you think about women who got married, who weren't allowed to have a checking account or a bank account or a credit card, or deny a husband or spouse sex, they had no words or legal language called rape and marriage. Domestic violence, we didn't have those words. It was not uncommon to see on television shows, and it was not uncommon to see women with black eyes or bruises, because the common practice was for a husband to keep his wife in line through physical violence. Oftentimes, victims of sexual violence have just had to endure in silence.
So you said a few moments ago that sex trafficking is maybe the more salient problem, but that labor trafficking is perhaps more prevalent. Let's talk about
Yes.
labor trafficking for a moment. How does it typically manifest? What does it look like? And how do you know if it's happening in your community?
The things that they're going to look for in labor trafficking specifically, if we talk about construction, roofing, maybe you see a team of roofers that show up before the sun rises. They don't go home, or leave, because you don't know where they're going, but they don't leave until after the sun is set. They've been up there all day. You really don't see them taking a break, and perhaps they're not speaking English. You see them maybe moving to the location where they're going to go to work with transportation that's provided for them. Maybe it's a nail salon where the workers there might not speak fluent English or struggle to communicate in English. And you see them there working many hours a day. Maybe it's 7 days a week, no breaks. Same with restaurants, hotels, agriculture industry. It's really within every industry you can think of. The things that we encourage folks to look for are the people that may have a language barrier, that seem to be working long hours, no breaks. They may not have their documentation with them, may not know where it is, may not even be able to answer what city that they're living in, may not know how to get in touch with law enforcement, may be afraid to talk to law enforcement because they've been threatened that they'll be deported if they do talk to law enforcement. In Montana, we see it within the construction industry, within the hotel industry, nail salons, restaurants.
You mentioned business models a few moments ago. Like, how do these arrangements come to be?
Probably the most visible business model is going to be the illicit massage businesses. And that's where you're going to see those businesses that present themselves as spas or places of massage, and they're typically set up in strip malls or converted houses. They're typically on streets where there's going to be a lot of activity, so a buyer will pass by that street. They're not going to really look like a place that you would think that you're going to go get a legitimate massage. They may have a open neon flashing red sign. They may have ATM machines. They may be open 24 hours a day or late into the night. They may have if it's a commercial storefront, they're going to have blacked out windows or some type of curtain over those windows so you can't see into the establishment. The entrance may be in the back of the establishment. And within the illicit massage industry, all of those businesses are predominantly Chinese organized crime. They're typically networked, and so they're networked throughout the United States, and they're all cash businesses. So that money is going to move around the United States and be laundered through different types of legitimate businesses like nightclubs or strip clubs or restaurants, but it will eventually find its way back to China, to where the leaders of the organized crime networks are.
And there's a distinction between something like employing an undocumented worker in the trades, for example, and actually engaging in trafficking.
Immigrant work is really how our country began thriving economically. My grandparents were immigrants. If you're not Native American, your heritage is going to be from immigrants. This is how we built the economy of this country. But when you talk about labor trafficking and done illegally, that can involve smuggling, that can involve giving a fraudulent offer, where you're saying to someone in an impoverished country, well, I'll help you get over to the United States. I'll purchase your visa for you. I'll purchase your travel for you. I'll have you come over here and you can get a really good job and you can send money back to your family and to your country. So come on over and work for me and I'll give you a really good job. What was presented to them will have been a false presentation. So when they get here, their documents are taken. They're typically all placed in housing, crammed in together in poor
Right.
living conditions and forced to work for little to no pay.
I mean, they're essentially brought into slavery.
Correct. It is modern day slavery.
We'll be back to my conversation with Penny Ronning after this short break. A New Angle is proudly presented by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. This show does not happen without these pillars of our community, and I'm so grateful for their support and encouragement. And speaking of support, have you checked out our new website yet? anewanglepodcast.com. There you can support our show directly with a variety of subscription options. Subscribers get access to bonus episodes, additional segments, writings, and other benefits. So check it out at anewanglepodcast.com.
Hi, this is Sheila Stearns, Commissioner Emerita of the Montana University System and former president of the University of Montana. You are listening to one of my favorite podcasts, A New Angle.
Welcome back to A New Angle. I'm speaking with Penny Ronning about human trafficking and its prevalence in Montana. And some communities want to sort of redefine prostitution as sex work, but what we're describing or what you're talking about with sex trafficking is completely different.
100%. Yes. Okay. With that, we would preface it by stating that 99% of victim workers in prostitution do not want to be there, but they feel there are no other options available to them to pay bills. They may be single parents. They may be trying to pay off some debt of some kind. They may just simply be trying to live.
There has been kind of a trend to recast prostitution as sex work and to sort of try to associate it with kind of this is a choice and there's dignity in this work. And the statistics that you're talking about paint a completely different picture.
So we would tell you that while society and those out there have long pressed that prostitution is the oldest profession, we would say to you that prostitution is the oldest oppression. There are all genders who feel empowered to do sex work, and they do believe that is an honorable profession, and that's the profession that they're choosing for their own life. For that would be sex work, and that would be defined in that way. We would tell you, though, that is not the predominance of what is prostitution today. We would also share that those that have been victim workers would say that when legalization comes in to decriminalize the entirety of what prostitution is, because prostitution is consent. Human trafficking, there is no consent. Right. So with prostitution, there's going to be consent among the seller, the body, the person who's selling their body. If there is a pimp involved, there's going to be consent there, and there's going to be consent in the buyer. So any one of those players can be charged with prostitution if it's considered an illegal crime within that state, as in most states it is, other than different rural parts of Nevada. We would say to you that what we feel needs to happen is the decriminalization of the person who is in charge of their own bodily autonomy if they want to sell their body for commercial sex, and that is 100% their choice, then that is a sex worker who should be able to do that legally, and there be no criminalization on that individual. What we do feel as though needs to continue to be in place, though, is the criminalization of a buyer and a trafficker. And so the criminalization of buying commercial sex, because of the violence that is involved in the purchase of commercial sex. And it is heavily violent.
And Penny, how do children fall into this life?
Well, they never fall into it. They are groomed into it. And,
Okay.
much like my mother's story, in human trafficking, what we see, especially amongst domestic minor sex trafficking, it is predominantly a family member that is first either selling or committing some type of sexual violence against a
Wow.
child. And it's not the white van taking someone, kidnapping someone. That's, what you see in the movies. It's typically not that. It's typically a family member that is grooming a child or selling a child. And those are hard conversations for us to have in this country. But those are the conversations we need to be having. With technology today, they only need, a smart device and a place to make that connection. So what we see for children today, where they're highly vulnerable, is online chat rooms. We're seeing that crime just explode exponentially against children being sextorted.
So walk us through the mechanics there. For a lot of parents listening who, they may or may not have a handle on how their child is using their smartphone or whatever. Like, what are kind of the mechanics of how a child would be sort of lured into this type of arrangement?
In the United States, we have not had any significant federal legislation passed protecting children online for over 20 years. It's been almost 25 years.
Mm.
So can you imagine how big tech has become? And so it's like the Wild West out there right now with no regulation, no oversight of these big tech companies. And the amount of money that big tech is pulling in for the sale of children and
Yes.
the commercial sex acts online is into the billions and billions of dollars. So big tech is fighting every type of federal legislation there is to put online child protection in place. The majority of parents, I don't think that they know all of the different online tools that are on a child's smartphone when they give a smartphone or some type of smart device, because parents today, the digital age was just coming into place when they were young.
Yeah. I mean, I like to think of it as, parents are digital immigrants and children are digital natives at this point.
It's a learning place for parents, and it's really hard when there's a lot of pressure out there, that Susie's got this app on her phone and Tommy has that app on his phone, and the parents are trying to figure out what those apps are, and they don't know what tools and resources they've got out there to teach them what apps they are, and they can't keep ahead of all of the different apps and the games that are online today. But predators know exactly where to find those kids. Snapchat, Roblox, Instagram, among the worst of the worst of the worst out there right now. And it's shocking how fast children will trust someone online and give over private information. And we see it happen all the time.
And is that the typical mechanism of leverage that somebody gives away private information, compromising information, and then that's used as leverage to get them to live a life of servitude, essentially?
What that groomer is going to look for is they're going to look for weaknesses. They're going to look for insecurities. They're going to look for needs that child is expressing. And when they find a young person that is showing needs for love, needs for attention. Maybe things are challenged at home for them, challenged at school for them. Those predators are going to look for those things, and they're going to be asking very simple and very basic questions. But to that child, those questions are going to seem caring and endearing, and that this person is really listening to me and is giving time to me. But really that predator is gathering information about that child's loved ones to use to threaten that child with. What we see among young males, is really challenging here. And these, again, are hard conversations. But what we're seeing among young males is how quickly young males will believe that someone on the other end of that chat or that instant messaging is someone who wants to be perhaps sexually or romantically involved with them. And
Sure.
it's typically going to be a predator on the other end. And it's amazing how fast they can get that young boy to send a nude image. And once that happens, the threats and shame will begin.
What's the next move? How does it go from that threatening scenario that you just described to engaging in non-consensual sex work?
Kids, and we all know through science that, their brains are not fully developed until they're about 25, 26 years old. And so when you think of a young person's brain, and if you ever have conversations with young people, it's typically all or nothing, everyone or no one.
Yeah.
There's very little gray matter in there. And it's hard for kids to reason that there could be someone that they could go to. There could be a teacher, there could be a parent, there could be law enforcement, an SRO. There could be someone that they could go to say, hey, this person on the other side of my phone is wanting me to do bad things. But for a young person, it's about shame, and that now everyone at their school is going to see this nude image because the predator is threatening to do that. The predator's threatening to harm their young sister or brother or their parents or their pets. And the young individual, they're believing these threats. And they're not wanting their parents to be disappointed in them. They're not wanting to experience the shame that they may experience amongst their peers. Plus the fact they don't want to be bullied because they've probably seen other kids be bullied. The hard part about this is getting adults to understand how fast this happens for a young person. So the directions that predator's going to take, they're going to either extort that young person for money and make them send hundreds of dollars, or they're going to extort them to do violent acts, or they're going to convince them to kill themselves. Wow. And so it goes from bad to extremely horrifying very, very quickly for this young person.
Stay tuned for part 2 of my conversation with Penny Ronning next week. Thanks for listening to A New Angle. If you like what we do and want to support us directly, please consider a subscription at anewanglepodcast.com. A New Angle is recorded at Studio 49, a generous gift from UM alums Michelle and Lauren Hansen. Our presenting sponsors are First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. Kelly Larson is our producer. Maddie Jordan is our production assistant. VTO, Jeff Ament, and John Wicks made our music. And Jeff Meese is our master of all things sound. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.